Yeah, according to my timepieces, even with the time change, it's about time for us to start. And so, Bill and Diana, although there's just two of you here, I'd be glad to kick this webinar off because I've really appreciated the content that Anabel has been able to bring to us. And so, Anabel, if you're willing, and Stan, if you're willing, we'll go ahead and begin. Let me know if we should wait for another few minutes to see if we catch another few folks or not. In the meantime, I'll do a little bit of housekeeping. Anabel, shall we go ahead, you think?
Well, if you want to do a little housekeeping, just to wait a minute and see, that's fine.
Okay, good. Why don't I do a little bit of that and then introduce you, and we'll just go ahead and start. I see that Sue has joined us from Lewiston, so we're up to 3. That's great. Sue, glad to have you with us too. We were just discussing if we wanted to wait for others to join us, so here you are. That's great. A few housekeeping things as we begin. Note that we have some other webcasts on the schedule coming up. In January, we'll have 2 webcasts by Stuart Murray Williams, and Stan continues to work at putting some others together. So, Stan, I'm looking forward to what you are arranging for us. For those of you who are joining us and interested in continuing education units, I'll provide that link for you at the end of our time. Plus, I have 2 short polls, as most of our webinars do, just to ask you how well this format's working for you and to give us a quick evaluation of the content. So at the very end, if you'd wait for that and help us by giving us some feedback, that'd be great. Other than that, I'd like to introduce Anabel Proffitt so that we can actually start. So Anabel is the Associate Professor of Educational Ministries at Lancaster Theological Seminary. She's a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, where she obtained her Ph.D., the Presbyterian School of Christian Education, where she obtained her M.A., and Hood College, where she did her undergrad work. An ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, she's an active member and adult Sunday school teacher at Hamilton Park United Church of Christ in Lancaster. During the summer months, though, she serves as pastor of the Childwell Memorial Presbyterian Church in Adirondack Park in upstate New York. She's the author of numerous articles on religious education and is currently completing a book entitled The Sense of Wonder, Pathos and Play in Religious Education.
Okay, thanks, Benton. Glad to be with you all. Glad to see you here, Sue, Jonathan, Diana, and Bill. I'm looking forward to carrying on this conversation and sharing some material with you. I'd like to begin by sharing a quote with you that I think is a very interesting and maybe kind of challenging quote, maybe especially for someone like me who grew up in the Reformed tradition, which has a very big emphasis on sin. And as I read this quote, and you can see it on the screen, I invite you to just respond to it. So this is a quote by Abraham Joshua Heschel, who says, "Among the many things that religious tradition holds in store for us is a legacy of wonder. The surest way to suppress our ability to understand the meaning of God and the importance of worship is to take things for granted. Indifference to the sublime wonder of living is the root of sin." Now, I'm just curious, how were you brought up to understand sin? And what do you make of that claim that indifference to the sublime wonder of living is the root of sin? Yes? No? Does it match what you were raised seeing sin as? Go ahead and type a response. I see Sue is starting to type. Hope others will too. Jonathan is? Great. Oh, multiple attendees. Wonderful. Okay, Sue says, "Although not what I was taught, I do see this as true. Ingratitude is the root of sin, not being in touch with the wonder of God." Okay. Okay. Sin was seen as more transactional. Jonathan, can you say a little more about what you mean by transactional? More what you did, perhaps? Others are typing into this discussion. Okay, Diana is saying, I don't recall this being taught, but I truly believe it's true for me now. I think I would have to say the same kind of thing. It wasn't part of my upbringing, but something in it really strikes a chord. So Jonathan's saying that transactional has to do with what God expects and how those expectations are lived out. Okay. A couple other people are typing. Enton suggesting that indifference to the wonders of God distance us from the holy. We take it for granted and lose the awe and worship for how wonderfully we have been made. Yes. When we move away from gratitude and awareness of God, it leads to those transactions or omissions. Indeed. Well, as we go through this material that I've been working on wonder, I think we'll come back to some of these ideas that you are suggesting, and I invite you to listen for them. And now I see Bill has added his voice. What I was taught is different from what I have learned. That's a nice way to put it. Pride being the root of all sin, we do sometimes take for granted that we know the all-knowing God. But we have so much to learn. Yes. Diana is saying, the older I get, the more I look to the wonder of what God brings to my life and world. It makes getting up each morning interesting. Indeed, it does. Well, one of the stories I want to share with you is how as a youngster and later as a young adult, I attended church camp every summer. And an enduring memory of those summers is that of the scene around the Vesper Circle at various camps. And any of you who've been to a camp probably know about the ubiquitous Vesper Circle. At one camp, the circle was at the top of a mountain. A large, rough-hewn wooden cross was built and erected at the open end of the circle of narrow wooden benches and stood before a background of magnificent mountain scenery. At another camp, the Vesper Circle was built on the edge of a lake. It was positioned so that the sunset over the lake served as the backdrop for the large wooden cross. Many evenings that cross stood in stark black relief against the spectacular orange, red, and pink streaks of a sunset. One of the perennial conundrums raised for me by Vespers in this context was how to reconcile the juxtaposition of the natural beauty of the sunset over the lake and the powerful vista of mountain ranges fading into the evening mist. I associated the cross with my church, with the stories of Jesus and the wonder I felt at the sacrifice of his love on behalf of the world, and the resulting kind of intentional Christian community that grew out of that kind of loving. On the other hand, I associated the beauty of the mountains and the lake with many experiences of wonder I'd had in natural settings. But the trouble was I didn't know what these had to do with Jesus or his cross. Neither in my church nor in the camp setting were these symbols explicitly linked by the adults teaching me. So the wonder of the mountains and the lake remained separate from the wonder of the cross. Now through the years, I'll share my picture. Through the years, as I've shared this aspect of my faith story with others, I've found that I'm not alone in puzzling over these seemingly separated strands of religious experience that help shape my faith. Others report similar confusion. And I want to pause for a minute and just ask you whether you've experienced that confusion. Did any of you go to church camp and ever wonder how the cross related to the natural setting? Did anyone address that specifically? I invite you to type again. And while you're doing that, I'll share another story that I came across that relates to this. Ben Birnbaum, a Jewish author, in his essay, Why I Pray, recounts an experience that he had at the age of 6, standing on the edge of a meadow in upstate New York. He writes, "What happened is difficult to explain. The world became radiant. Though not the kind of radiant that makes you blink or close your eyes, in fact, it was not light that radiated, though it seemed light, but something more complex, something like a tone as it swells on the back of a chord that is being sounded by a full orchestra." Birnbaum describes how the experience felt. As human perception goes, in fact, it might be most accurate to say, I felt as though something had called out and I had heard. And hearing, I felt free, rooted, floating, flooded, ablaze, remote, close, certain, joyous, and strangely, he said, given the circumstances, absolutely calm. He continues, "Given what I had been taught, I should not have thought that this was God. Something wonderful, certainly, but not God." He explains, "The God I knew and even loved commanded us, reproved us, made us attentive and busy, maybe transactional. Even so," Birnbaum asserts, "I knew this was God that I had seen and who had seen me. And I did not at the time think this was remarkable, and for some reason still don't." Nevertheless, he reports, he did not tell others of the experience. He explains, "It wasn't as if, for example, I had seen a bear or a deer come out of the woods and cross the meadow. That is something I would have related to my mother. But about God, I said nothing." So let me see what you all are saying in response to this. Sue, you mentioned feeling that they connected, feeling the awe of it, though I don't think it was ever fully explained to us. So part of the connection for you was the beauty. Yeah. Bill, I agree this is a problem sometimes at camps. Too often caught up in the program theme and then missing out on the connection between the cross and the surroundings. Yeah, that's a trap. Jonathan, you're saying you didn't feel that dissonance. Because the cross wasn't really a central image in your camp or church experience. Okay. Stan, not a strong connection in the church because of its evangelical connection with a strong belief in the pre-tribulation. Well, that leads to another story I want to share with you by yet a third person who describes a similar kind of disconnect or conundrum. Theologian Roberta Bondi, in her book, Memories of God, also reports on her early religious experience and its disconnect from her fundamental Christian upbringing. She writes, "Certainly I never connected the resurrection with what actually did get me through my childhood and my adolescence too, the experience of beauty. Daily the ordinary sight of a perfect shape in a rock, the light coming through a piece of colored glass, the secret sound of bells on a wind harp, always had the power to comfort and soothe me. But sometimes when I hurt so much that I could hardly bear it, I would experience something through the medium of beauty that for a moment would simply annihilate my pain and longing and helplessness. Then the sunlight coming through a glass of water, or a single note from a flute would flash out with a power that would flood me with fierce happiness. Bondi continues her account with the observation that from her earliest childhood, she had regarded these experiences with a holy reverence. She explains, "I believed that in these rare moments of flashing joy, I was being allowed to look through a kind of window into the actual good, generous, and powerful heart of the universe itself, a heart that belonged to a hidden God, who loved me, but who also was totally impersonal." Bondi tells of another memorable religious experience when she picked up the Hebrew Bible and read the opening words of Genesis in Hebrew for the first time. She says, "In that moment of intense happiness, I knew I was face to face with the God who had not just created the world and found it good, but created and rejoiced in me as well." But again, here's the odd thing. Bondi reports, "I did not connect the God I met that day with my child's secret God of beauty." Like me and my dilemma with the cross and the sunset, Bondi had trouble connecting her childhood's secret God of beauty with the God of the Hebrew Bible and of resurrection. Now, I've since wondered if this separation, at least in my case, had something to do with the neo-Orthodox theological upbringing of my Presbyterian childhood. Neo-Orthodox theology viewed natural theology with great suspicion. Or it may simply be that the strong emphasis on Christology led to an oversight in paying attention to the natural world. Now, another possibility suggested by James Gustafson in his work, Ethics from a Theocentric Perspective. The human being, he suggests, has become the measure in religion, theology, and ethics. Religion has turned from the celebrations of the glory of the natural order to preoccupation with the subjective problems of human beings. Put even more bluntly, he says, religion and God have been put in the service of human needs. Religion and God have been put in the service of human needs. Theology continues to assure human beings that the deity serves to fulfill particular human desires. Now, what's missing is our understanding of ourselves as part of a larger web of life that makes up the created order. Human beings are not the center of the universe. Such an understanding, says Gustafson, requires paying attention to some of the basic intuitions of Western religious experience. Intuitions that human life is part of and depends upon realities that are grander, more majestic, and more awesome than humanity itself. I believe that a sense of wonder is important to the religious life because it functions as one of those basic intuitions and helps us to sense our relatedness to realities grander, more majestic, and more awesome than humanity itself, and thereby to see ourselves and our world in a proper, less self-centered perspective. These are intuitions which, again, Abraham Joshua Heschel speaks of in his inimitable poetic style. He writes, "Obviously, we can never sneer at the stars, mock the dawn, or scoff at the totality of being. Sublime grandeur evokes unhesitating, unflinching awe. Away from the immense, cloistered in our own concepts, we may scorn and revile everything. But standing between earth and sky, we are silenced by the sight." I still have vivid memories of a night field trip at camp, where we took our towels and spread out in a field, laying down and gazing up at the stars. I remember seeing what looked like a blanket of tiny lights winking in a deep blue sky, galaxies light years away, beckoning my imagination to soar. How could there be so many stars? How many planets might be circling each one? Were there other people out there laying on their backs somewhere in a field, wondering if I existed? The beauty of the night sky took my breath away. I felt so tiny as I looked up into that vastness. The counselor then started to read Psalm 8, echoing my thoughts while inviting me and my thoughts into that long tradition of my religious ancestors who also reflected on their part in the vastness of the universe. O Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. When I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? Mortals, that you care for them. Having the opportunity to lie on my back and view the night sky brought the words of this psalm to life for me. The experience forged a connection between the ancient words and my young life, helping me to make sense of my place in the world. The wonder it evoked was marked by the sense of contingency engendered by the vastness of that night sky, in contrast to my small person. The psalm reinforced that contingency. What are human beings that you are mindful of them, O God? But it also provided the assurance of dependability. You care for them. That allowed me to revel in the wonder evoked by the juxtaposition of the experience and the words. For it was not only the night sky that was a wonder, but the fact that a creator so awesome that he or she could create millions of galaxies should care for human beings like me. The sense of wonder contributes to recognizing that we must conduct life so as to relate to all things in a manner appropriate to their relation to God. Not their relation to me, their relation to God. Wonder engenders in us a sense of the value of things, an intuition of the inherent preciousness of all that God has created. Wonder thus has a contribution to make to the theological task that Gustafson identifies. He says, concern for human salvation must be placed in a wider context than that of Ptolemaic religion. The preoccupation with self has to be altered. The proper orientation is not primarily toward self, but toward God, to the honoring of God and to the ordering of life in relation to what can be discerned of the divine ordering. Now, I think this statement offers some clues as to why the cross, juxtaposed against the lake, was a powerful theological symbol, creating a dialogue between the theologies of creation and those of redemption. That dialogue itself served as a decentering of either one, and it challenged the pervasive concern for human salvation by placing that human concern in the context of the whole of creation. At the same time, the dialogue also suggested that redemption might be oriented to the whole of creation and not just to the human species. Now I'm going to pause for a minute here and ask you to respond to what I've just said, because it really is a very different kind of, I think, view of, at least for those of us who've been brought up in a place where Christology was the absolute center. What do you think about that idea that placing the cross against the sunset or against the majesty of the mountains is an important theological statement because of the way it may decenter theologies of creation and theologies of redemption and put them into dialogue with each other? Curious how you respond to that claim. So I invite you to type. Jonathan and Stan are typing some responses. Part of what I think is powerful about this kind of theological connection is the way it may offer us something as we think about our fragile ecology in a creation that we are pretty busy destroying because of our human wants and needs. Diana's typing as well. I know this isn't something either that's easy to make a quick statement. Okay, Stan saying, we rely on Romans to affirm the ideas of salvation and righteous. We need to rethink passages such as Romans 3:21. Well, certainly it seems to me that if we rely on Romans alone, that may contribute to this human-centered religion that Augustine speaks about. Typing. Okay. I guess I've thought of the cross as holding together the vastness of the whole, or if not holding it together, bridging them in a more transcendent way. Yeah, I think that's a nice way to look at it. And I think that for me, that juxtaposition, the power of it, was the way it suggested that redemption was for the whole of creation and not just for human beings. But my church pretty much stuck to teaching about redemption as for individual salvation. Diana and Sue are doing some typing. I also just want to point out as a Christian educator how important I think it is that scriptures like Psalm 8 be read in the context of a starry sky. I think too often we don't pay enough attention to the context in which we share biblical material. And the context can shape how we hear it. Diana, I think it's an important dialogue, if only to remind us that God is the creation, or the creator, and we really cannot have one without the other. Absolutely. Yes. Sue, the cross represents to me returning to God's original intent, which would include the brokenness of individuals and of all of creation. That creation itself is broken, not just human beings. Great. Well, I think that wondering even at the smallest part of the creation can contribute to realigning our perspective away from preoccupation with self to a wider context than that of Ptolemaic religion. I have another story along that line. A few years ago, I was invited to teach a class session on wonder at a British university. In preparation for the class, I asked the students to meditate on some questions. When the session began, I invited them to share their responses to the question, what evokes awe in you? I asked, expecting reactions like I often get at such gatherings, things like sunsets, or the stars, or the birth of a baby. Well, there was a silence. And then one of the students responded. Conkers, she said. I looked at her. Conkers? I asked in a bewildered tone. Yes, conkers, she replied. You know, horse chestnuts in their cases. Oh, I see, I said, mentally translating American buckeyes from British conkers. And I agreed with her that one could be in awe of this beautiful example of God's handiwork. Then the professor, who regularly taught the class, chimed in. I don't think you can be in awe of conkers, he exclaimed. Awe, he explained, is reserved for really big things, like God or the universe. The student and I disagreed with him, citing Thomas Green, who says, the wonder that is ceaseless, that can never be exhausted, has always to do with what is usual and close at hand. For the marvel of a thing has less to do with its frequency than with its contingency. Well, the professor looked skeptical, but decided to let the point drop. Now, the next weekend, while worshiping in Salisbury Cathedral, a place that even that professor would agree evokes awe, I ran across this account in the cathedral's Eucharistic service booklet, attributed to Julian of Norwich, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of you have heard of this before. She wrote, he showed me a little thing, the size of a hazelnut, in the palm of my hand, and it was as round as a ball. I looked at it with my mind's eye, and I thought, what can this be? The answer came. It is all that is made. I marveled that it could last, for I thought it might have crumbled to nothing. It was so small. And the answer came into my mind. It lasts and ever shall, because God loves it. And all things have their being through the love of God. Now, as the service went on around me, I had to stop myself from laughing out loud because it seemed like God's answer to our little disagreement the previous week. Surely a conquer can be a sign that all things have their being through the love of God. And what could be a greater wonder than that? The contingency of that little thing, juxtaposed with this affirmation of the dependability of God's love, nevertheless, to sustain it, creates the conditions for wonder to emerge from the encounter. Whether it is a conker, a hazelnut, or even a crabapple, it's always possible for wonder and awe to be evoked, because everything, large or small, lasts and ever shall, because God loves it. Because God loves it is the legacy of wonder which Judeo-Christian traditions hold in store for us, of which Heschel speaks in the quote we saw at the beginning of this presentation. And we would do well to heed Heschel's warning that the surest way to suppress our ability to understand the meaning of God and the importance of worship is to take things for granted. In this statement, Heschel highlights the flip side of Julian's insight. Not only do things in this world have value because they reflect the wonder of the love of God, but we know something about who God is when we notice and wonder at the things that God has made. They're signposts, allusions to the character of God. Now, I think the conquer incident illustrates multiple dimensions of theological significance that wonder has for us. It highlights wonder's role in preventing us from taking things for granted, whether it's taking something as large as the deity for granted or something as small as a conquer. And second, when coupled with Julian of Norwich's vision, it illustrates the role of a religious tradition in shaping our vision of the world, and therefore how we experience and interpret the wonder of it. Of course, something as small as a hazelnut or conker can be a sign of God's love if, and this is really important, it's an if, one is schooled in a religious tradition that teaches of a creator God who sustains the world with her or his loving and redeeming presence and activity. I also think that the professor's caution about awe being reserved for really big things is worthy of our attention, especially in a commercialized world where the statement, awesome, that's awesome, is bandied about to indicate approval of a particular candy bar or some new product being hawked on television. In an essay titled, "The Fear of God Don't Munch in the Presence of Mystery," writer John Alexander recounts his experience of an outdoor concert at which pianist Van Cliburn was playing a Tchaikovsky concerto with the Philadelphia Orchestra. Alexander says it was the kind of wonderful sound you get to hear live only a few times in your lifetime. He was struck by the casual attitude of a group of teens in the row in front of him who were eating popcorn. They might as well have been listening to a player piano, he comments. He goes on to say that this event had become for him a metaphor of how we live in God's universe, with little wonder, with little respect. He laments the way that we live in such a take-it-for-granted way, oblivious to the everyday wonders around us. He says, it's as though we eat popcorn while one greater than Eugene Ormandy conducts. We have nearly lost the ability to revere things, to sit in silent wonder, to have deep respect, to recognize majesty. We need the sense of wonder as a key ingredient in our religious and moral life, because the inability to revere things cuts us off from so much depth and grandeur and majesty, he says, as some of you said at the beginning of our presentation. We need wonder to get the scales off our eyes, because people with a sense of wonder, those who see the grandeur of the universe, those who feel the terrible majesty of God, such people will not participate in oppression. Why not? Alexander returns to his example of the teens at the concert. He says, without a sense of wonder, we also have a diminished sense of horror. The teenagers at the Van Cliburn concert may have realized they were breaking a rule, like don't make noise when the principal speaks at the assembly, but they probably didn't realize they were doing something almost sacrilegious. Without a sense of wonder that a human being is, we will have little sense of the horror of racism. We will just think a rule is being broken. I think that's a powerful statement. Without a sense of wonder that the human being is, we will have little sense of the horror of racism. We will just think it's a rule being broken. And we can extend this thinking to the horrors of war, genocide, economic oppression, sexual abuse, and environmental degradation. The list could go on and on. When Julian of Norwich envisions holding that tiny little ball in her hand, when the student in my class proclaims her awe at the sight of a conker, when Laura and I commune with a crabapple, we're enriching our lives and engaging in behavior that strengthens our moral fiber. To revere these small parts of creation is to bind oneself not only to the created order which spawned them and us, but also to the Creator, whose love and justice sustains us. It's to participate in a mystery which encompasses us and allows us to be both at home in the world and also to be astonished at it. Now, in theological terms, the source of the dependability which is necessary for wonder is beautifully expressed in Julian's vision that everything large or small lasts and ever shall because God loves it. The God of whom Julian speaks is a loving God. But what does it mean to speak of God as loving? Well, the Bible affirms that God's love is at the very heart of creation. To speak of the theological doctrine of creation is at once to reject the negative interpretation of life as an accident and to make the positive affirmation that life is a gift. The one who creates is parent, and God's motivation in giving life is love. Now that point probably sounds pretty obvious to those of us who've been raised in a Christian tradition. But I think it's just important to remember that our view of creation is shaped within the tradition's view that creation is the handiwork of a loving God. This in turn shapes our sense of participation in that creation. God as a source of dependability allows us to experience our contingency in the world as a gift rather than as a threat. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well, says the psalmist of Psalm 139. Love as a source of dependability isn't something fixed or rigid, but something which is resilient and responsive. We're not speaking of the God of the deists, but the God of the Bible, whose presence and activity on the part of the world is told in story after story. From the mighty acts on behalf of the Israelites to God's entrance into humanity through the humble birth of Jesus. The dependable God enters the utter contingency of human existence. For what could be more contingent than being born of peasant parents in a stable? And thereby, this entrance into human existence transforms it into a new possibility for human relationship with the divine and with the created order. But now here's another twist. I think that this is not the only theological contribution that a sense of wonder can make to our faith. That is, making us aware of the dependability of God. But the sense of wonder can also prevent us from becoming complacent about the dependability of God's love. I think all too often, in the mainline churches, we have a tendency to take the dependability of God's love for granted, forgetting that it's a choice that God has made on our behalf. Then we miss the wonder of it. And no one makes this point more clearly than Annie Dillard, who writes, "Nothing could more surely convince me of the continued existence of the church, or nothing could more surely convince me of God's unending mercy than the continuing existence of the church. The higher Christian churches, where, if anywhere, I belong," she says, "come at God with an unwarranted air of professionalism, with authority and pomp, as though they knew what they were doing, as though people were themselves an appropriate set of creatures to have dealings with God. I often think of the set pieces of liturgy as certain words which people have successfully addressed to God without their getting killed. In the high churches, they saunter through the liturgy like Mohawks along a strand of scaffolding, who have long since forgotten their danger. If God were to blast such a service to bits, the congregation would be genuinely shocked." Now, when I share this quote with folks in workshop settings, I'm often surprised at the vehemence of some people's negative reaction to the suggestion that God might blast a service to bits. They argue that if God is love, then God wouldn't dream of blasting a service to bits. The risk in portraying the dependability of God's love is that the dependability can be taken for granted. And we forget that the dependability is itself contingent upon God's choosing. This is certainly one of the messages of the Genesis story of the flood. When we forget that it's a choice God makes, we mistake the nature of God's power. When C.S. Lewis portrays God in the Chronicles of Narnia, he renders God in the figure of Aslan, a lion who's perceived as loving yet dangerous. Like the God of Moses who shielded Moses from seeing God's face lest he die, the magnificence of God is too dangerous for human beings to approach. Without a sense of wonder, we may not recognize the contingency of God's love, a contingency found in the very nature of a God who is dangerously holy, and yet wondrously, who chooses to approach the human race with compassion. I think we need writers like Annie Dillard to help us cultivate a religious imagination in order to prevent us from believing that we have a handle on who God is. We need many images of God, from God as loving parent to God as judge, from God as transcendent other to God as an image of the holy invisibly woven in and through and working in the processes of life itself. It's in our commitment to new growth and new learning, to stepping out beyond our present schemas and safe ways of knowing and being, that we experience the presence of the holy. It's when our ways of understanding God become rigid, locked into a particular set of schemas or doctrines, that we are in danger of idolatry. Wonder, I think, helps us to stay in touch with that sense of mystery that reminds us that no particular human schema can capture who God is. A more powerful case for the importance of wonder in our religious life can hardly be made, and yet it seems so absent in our churches. Now, this point comes home to me every other fall when I teach a course on confirmation and baptismal preparation. I start the course by asking students to report on their experiences of baptismal preparation or confirmation as youth. Now, for students from the creedal traditions, invariably we get into discussions about the creeds and confessions that were part of their confirmation education. My students from United Church of Christ congregations regularly dislike or even despise the Heidelberg Catechism. It's a catechism that is sort of considered the bedrock of Reformed faith, or German Reformed faith. And it's ubiquitous in the churches in my area of Pennsylvania. Now, at first I was very surprised at how much they disliked this catechism, because I always experienced it as a very powerful and personal statement of faith. It's created in a kind of question and answer format. Well, further conversations with the students revealed a significant difference in my first experience of this catechism and their experience of it. You see, I didn't grow up in the United Church of Christ congregation, and so my first exposure to this catechism was as an adult, and I discovered it in a devotional guide which introduced me to the clauses, to the questions and answers of the catechism in the context of prayer exercises, which included meditations on hymns, theological reflections, and classical artworks, including Rembrandt and Van Gogh. The words of the Heidelberg Catechism filled me with wonder. Question: what is your only comfort in life and in death? The answer, that I belong, body and soul, in life and in death, not to myself, but to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, who at the cost of his own blood has fully paid for all my sins. How could one be sanguine in the face of a statement like that? I belong. I've been redeemed. It doesn't have to be that way, yet it is. But for most of my students, sadly, the Heidelberg Catechism was experienced as something to memorize, as part of their ticket to confirmation. Their memories of it include lectures by their pastors, coupled with assignments to memorize portions of the Catechism. They could parrot the words. Some could even pass a written test on its meaning. But the connection between the doctrines expressed in the Catechism and their own piety was never made. They see no wonder in its marvelous words of belonging to God. It lives in their lives only as a set of propositions, and the affect attached to it is negative, for a host of pedagogical reasons that have nothing to do with the theology of the Heidelberg Catechism itself. Every time I confront such attitudes, I feel sad and angry. And the experience has led me to question not only what we teach in the church, but how we teach it, and how we understand what it is that we're teaching. That is, the teaching of a catechism only by rote is not only bad method, but it does injustice to the subject matter itself. And I would say the same thing of the way we often teach the Bible as I would of the way the catechism has been taught. And this is because the catechism cannot simply be a matter of cognition. The words of the catechism express beliefs that go beyond the cognitive, and yet their affective and behavioral aspects tend to be ignored. I really believe that if we don't approach catechisms or Bible studies with an attitude of wonder, we will miss their meaning for our lives. I think we need curiosity and wonder to characterize the sharing of our faith if we want to see it embraced by the next generation. We must be willing to create what-if spaces to allow those in our parishes to explore multiple meanings, both cognitive and affective, of the doctrines that we hold. We must share our own experiences of wonder, both those brought on by the contingencies of our lives and those growing out of a deep sense of dependability. I think our students deserve to wrestle with images of God, images of a God who could blast a service to bits, and of a God who loves every hair on their head. To do anything less is to dishonor those whom we serve. Well, that ends the piece of what I want to share with you, and I would like to invite any questions or comments that you may have. Wonder if any of you have had similar experiences where something is taught in a very rote way that seems to work against what it's really trying to say.
Well, thank you, Anabel, for sharing with us this afternoon. And as our participants may be typing some comments or questions, I just want to go back to a statement that you made earlier about how we have that losing a sense of focus, that we can have a diminished sense of horror as well, so that we're just living by rules. What are some of the changes that you're seeing in maybe our culture and the church, where we are having this this less of a sense of wonder, and as a result of that, a diminished sense of horror, and we seem to be more rule-based, I guess you could say?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think media plays a big role in this. And I do worry sometimes about the way that, people don't have direct relationships with each other. And what impact does having relationships, for instance, through social media do to our sense of connection to people?
Yeah. We, for
Do you have some?
Well, I was just wondering, when I look at just some of the dialogue that goes on within even our congregations and within our culture as well, I would say too the media has a big role, but I wonder in what ways, there's a connection, it seems like. In what ways does science help us with that sense of wonder, and also in what ways does science diminish our sense of wonder?
Yeah. Well, I would hope that it would help our sense of wonder, but and I think the church shouldn't be afraid of it. Right now, I'm working with a Doctor of Ministry student here at the seminary who's writing a curriculum on science, connections between science and biblical story and the Christian tradition. And she has some amazing stories to tell in her congregation about, she does vacation Bible schools where they study, one year they did archaeology and one year they did biology, and it's just been a remarkable thing that really is full of wonder for the kids. And I think also, it's powerful because it does connect, again, the creation with the redemptive side of the story we have to tell.
Yeah. Could you say more about, I forgot now exactly how you stated it earlier, but in a sense that God's presence, and the capacity that God has to pull back, in terms of God's grace and everything else. I don't want to misquote you, and I wrote it down somewhere and I can't find it in my notes, but could you say more about that?
Is this related to that idea that God can bless the service to this, you mean? That God is dangerous? Yeah. And I'm sure this in part comes out of my more Reformed heritage, which is pretty big on the transcendence of God. When I look at a lot of curriculum and what's done for children, it pretty much focuses almost always on God loves you, God will be there. God can become the big Santa Claus in the sky, which I think sets us up when at some point in our lives things don't go our way and things fall apart. I also think that I really believe that we can't understand fully what the statement God loves us means unless we recognize that God chooses to love us and that God does not have to do that. And I do think the biblical story of the flood that's part of what that's about. And we have to figure out, how do we teach that in a way that doesn't, terrify people. But that's why we pay attention to the rainbow, the promise that God says, I'm not going to do that again. But God could.
Yeah.
And we really can't understand who God is if we don't recognize that piece of who God is.
Well, I was also...
So I think for me, that's why love is a wonder.
Yeah. The other... one of the things, too, was that in my tradition, because there was this connection, there's reconnection to creation and how the cross stands in this... as the way of holding things together. There was a reassessment of how we read Romans and some of those other texts and writings of Paul, to where for example in Romans 3:21, it's not, the focus seems to be on the person's faith in Christ rather than the faithfulness of God, holding up salvation and reconciliation. And so that was kind of one of those transitions and rewarding points. And some of that was actually stimulated by us having to read Gustafson. So
good. I'm glad. I'm glad.
And because there's Gustafson, and then it was interesting to read the critique of Gustafson as well by a number of scholars, including John Howard Yoder and Gordon Kaufman and several others, because they had this conference over the writings about the writings of Gustafson. So, all right. Well, we're at a point. I see Jonathan is typing, and I think we've got everybody's responses in there. Anabel, is there anything more that you want to say before Enton needs to come on and just? Oh, here we go. Jonathan says, if we
just want to say, Yeah.
Okay. Jonathan has a statement.
Yeah. That's a great statement.
Mm-hmm.
That right. If we understand it primarily as a set of answers, but if it's about questions, it's driven by wonder. I totally agree with that. And unfortunately, science has been somewhat co-opted by technology, and it becomes science is only good if it's, what can we use it for?
Right.
And but keeping it very open to having it be, what is this amazing world we live in? That's a very different approach. So I like that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I like saying God on God's terms. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything that you'd like to say? And then we'll invite Antonin to do some wrap-up information with us as well.
I just want to say thank you all for joining with me. And any of you who are interested in this work or pursuing it, I invite you to stay in contact with me, and Enton will provide my email address. I love talking to people about this, and I think the church desperately needs wonder. So I hope you'll be part of it.